And this anti-sweatshop movement really gained steam again in the 20th century. Really in the 80s and 90s, it reignited again. But the movement in those days was less about these big workers' movements and more about collective action taken by activists who were boycotting. So boycotting was really big at that time. So people were just out and out refusing to buy from places that were creating goods and selling goods and factories that had these really terrible conditions that could be accurately described as sweatshops. But yet, these continue and still exist today. And in fact, well, there seems to be a new form of movement, so there's sort of a third wave of pushback against this movement, which has come now in the form of consumer activism. These supply chains, the way that goods are produced through supply chains and commodity chains, really make this fight more relevant than ever before. So today, because of the way consumables are produced, pushbacks against this form of production really do seem more relevant than ever before. This form of production that exists, in which third parties are supplying most of the products that are sold across the world, a lot of these global consumables, are manufactured in places like the global south, where, again, as I said, these worker rights movements have not been as successful, and wages remain very low, people are working long hours, and they can pump out a steady flow of global consumables that are used by people across the world for much less money. So we're continuing to protest against this form of movement, but we're just taking a different form. Yet these movements really seem more relevant today than ever before. According to the International Labor Rights Forum, between the year 2005 and 2012, more than 700 workers in Bangladesh factories died as a result of working conditions. So they were working in factories that had unsafe conditions, many of which collapsed or had fires, or they were injured so badly on the job that they died. So this is a pretty huge number. This is shocking when you think about how many people are killed as a direct result of working in a factory that's producing garments. These are clothes that we're buying. One of the main producers, or one of the main companies that uses this kind of production is H&M. So they've been very open about this. I mean, they were called out pretty drastically in the news, but they have admitted to the fact that they are in fact using these factories. Many of their factories have been implicated in these terrible fires and collapses of buildings. Yet H&M is a hugely successful company, and they're continuing to do very well. They're really doing a brisk business. They have more than 3,000 stores in over 50 markets of the world, and this is growing every year. They have said they're going to be making changes, so I don't want to come down too hard on them. They're aware of this problem. They say that they're working with some of the local workers' rights groups to try to make changes, but change is not coming fast enough. So look at this number. Look at the years here. And now look at this next line. Look at this jump. So they're making changes, but that number has more than doubled in the last year. There's been some really horrific fires. I'm sure that people have read about them in the news. So while H&M is talking about making changes, people are dying, and really large numbers of people. So change isn't happening fast enough. Yet, the way that we're pushing back against this kind of production has really changed. So if this was 30 years ago, people would probably be boycotting. They would say, I refuse to buy from H&M until there is some sort of change made. But today it's different. The way that we push back is more reflective of our current political and global landscape. We're shopping instead. We're making a change by spending, which is really about individual action. It's about personal choice. It's not about the collective anymore. But we are spending less. So I read these statistics, and I thought that this seemed pretty uplifting. So 40 years ago, we were spending over 10% of our household income on clothing and accessories. And in 2010, that number dropped. Not significantly, but it was still on a downward trend. So okay, maybe I'm wrong about this whole boycott shopping thing. Maybe we are spending less. Maybe we've decided we're not okay with so many people in Bangladesh dying in fires. But just because we're spending less, this is not really reflective of our actions. We're in fact buying more than ever before. Some statistics that came out last year indicated that Americans and Canadians buy an average of 64 items of clothing a year. That's on average. That is a huge number. To me, this seems crazy. And if that's the average, think about who's pushing that number up. So we're buying more than ever before and we're spending less, which again is reflective of the way supply chain capitalism works. We have access to more goods for a lower price. But why? Why are we shopping so much? Why are we buying 64 items of clothing a year? Well, for one thing, it feels good to buy. I mean, look at this lady, she's so happy. It's nice to shop, we like new things, we like to buy new outfits. Some of us like shoes. I am among those people. But it also has a lot to do with the way that clothes are being manufactured. We're living in a time of fast fashion. So clothing houses are developing clothes to be manufactured, mass-produced, marketed, sold, worn, and disposed of very quickly. In fact, as quickly as trends change, or as quickly as the clothing falls apart, which for me always seems to be the latter. So this form of consumption then, and this new way of producing clothing seems to really explain why in the Western world, we dispose of millions of tons of clothing per year. So in this visual, of course, this is not all clothing in this particular case, but think about that. Think about what millions of tons of clothing looks like. Think about what this means if we're buying 64 items of clothing a year and throwing them out once they're no longer in style. Yet, mass consumption has been positioned as a virtue. There's this message that we should keep shopping, we can continue to spend, but we have to do so with ethics in mind. So while the focus of ethical consumption often seems to be about practices that are happening in other parts of the world, in sweatshops in the global south, something that's a problem over there, we also have to keep in mind that this buy local movement, local production centers, local working practices are not merely as black and white as these advocates who really push for the local might have you believe. So the first example is one that we really can't escape from when we're talking about ethical consumption. I had to bring in Walmart, of course. So Walmart, we know, uses overseas suppliers. The supply chain is a really huge part of their financial success. They are certainly implicated in this whole supply chain capitalism that I've sort of been coming down on. But they also have practices happening locally in Canada and the United States that are also really questionable. So Walmart is the world's largest private employer. This is very important to keep in mind because the majority of their employees are paid either minimum wage or just above minimum wage. The majority are not making a living wage, and the majority are employed as part-time workers. So this means that the majority of employees in the world's largest private employer, they don't have access to things like healthcare plans, to the benefits that you would receive as a salaried full-time worker, or to overtime pay because they're being kept on as part-time employees. And this ability to access overtime pay is very important for low-wage earners. And another example that's closer to home, XL Foods, which might sound familiar to some people because they were in the news over the last few years for poor sanitation within their meat-producing factories. So this is Alberta beef. This is one of these other big buy local, buy Canadian beef, buy Alberta. But the Alberta government found when they were going into their factories after people started to get very ill, not before because deregulation is a big part of this industry, but when they started to investigate the circumstances that led to these poor sanitation procedures, they found that meat producers, such as XL Foods, tend to be working under very underregulated conditions. They're short-staffed, and workers are working very long shifts and expecting to produce a lot. So XL Foods at the time had their workers producing 2 million pounds of beef per day. So they're short-staffed, they're overworked, they're tired. It's no wonder that sanitation procedures possibly are slipping, and it's no wonder that employees are getting hurt. These are some of the places in which worker injury rates are extremely high. And this is happening in Canada. This is part of this local, buy Canadian beef movement. The example that really hurts me the most when I think about this, problematizing this buy local movement, is the Ontario farms. So I don't know about you, but I really do feel good when I go to a farmer's market and I buy directly from a farmer and I pay a little bit more for my fruits or vegetables, but I feel good about this choice. I feel like I'm kind of opting out of this big global capitalist movement. I'm making a one-on-one transaction. The farmer's probably wearing overalls. He might have a mustache. It's all very lovely. But there's been growing controversy over the years because many Ontario farmers, in fact, arguably most, the statistics are a little bit sketchy, but many are employing temporary workers. These are workers who are mostly coming from Mexico, so this is not just a problem in the US, this is happening right here in Ontario. And these workers, because they're temporary seasonal workers, again, they don't have access to overtime, and they're working long hours, they're working overtime hours, but the farmers do not need to pay them overtime. They also don't have access to OHIP because they're seasonal temporary workers. They don't have access to benefits, they don't have health care plans, yet they're paying into all of these same systems that the rest of us have to pay into. They pay into CPP, but they'll never see that money again. So this buy local movement, this farm fresh, this Alberta beef, all starts to become really questionable. When speed and scale trump human health and working conditions, it's no wonder that consumers start to push back. But is shopping for change really the answer? Do we want to consume to make a political change in the world? Markets can be used as a signaling device, certainly, but markets, we know, are really much more than that. They have the ability to commoditize objects, so they turn things that we purchase into objects of value that can be bought or sold for money. But they do the same to ideas. Social movements have really become a commodity that is marketable. There's real money involved in these social movements. So fair trade, for example, as a marketing strategy, has become a multi-billion-dollar business. Fair Trade Canada, for example, which is the Canadian arm of this larger fair trade organization, in addition to licensing and okaying the labeling of fair trade products, also has a huge promotional role to play. So they have over 1,000 fair trade products in Canada that they have a responsibility to market. They want to make sure that they can get these goods out to consumers, and the consumers know that they exist. They know that they can buy something that's considered more ethical. So in case you're listening to this talk tonight and you've decided, okay, I hear a lot about consumption, I'm hearing ethical, I'm tuning everything else out, I just want to go shopping, Fair Trade Canada is very helpful, and they have a handy tool that will help you find the nearest 26 locations selling their product. So you can rush right out and consume as soon as we're done here, if you like. They'll probably be closed, so perhaps not. But they're making it really easy for you to shop. They're making it easy for you to be an ethical consumer. So fair trade as a marketing strategy, or as a labeling strategy then, really speaks to this idea that this movement is about more than just signaling preferences, signaling values. It's also a branding tool. It's really being used to market products, to make sales. So branding is also being used as a signal. But of what exactly? It's important to consider how these kind of labels, like fair trade, organic, sweatshop free, are being applied and used, and by who? To whose benefit? One example that comes to mind when you're thinking about these labels and the use of these kind of products as a marketing tool is, again, we'll get back to the Toyota Prius. This is an interesting example to me because we know that Toyota, of course, is marketing a brand, slapping the hybrid logo on it, and it is a hybrid, but they also really pump up this environmental aspect of the hybrid. The Prius was the first hybrid on the market. It's the most popular. It sells better than any other hybrid out there, but it is in fact not the greenest. And on environmental tests, it performs about as well as do similarly sized diesel offerings. So this is interesting. But from a marketing perspective, it's hugely successful. And I read a bunch of consumer reports before doing this talk to see what Prius drivers thought of themselves as a Prius driver. And it turns out an awful lot. So the majority of Prius drivers, I'm sorry if there are any Prius drivers in here, but the majority believe that this car says something about them. They think it's sending a signal. It tells the world that they're environmental, that they're green, that they're making virtuous consumption choices. Even though we know, in fact, they could be making better choices. There are greener cars out there. So it seems that ethical consumption has become an industry in and of itself. It's a marketing strategy. There's something that people really are driven to about this whole idea of being an ethical consumer, even if it's not the most ethical product. Even if they haven't done the research to figure out that they could be buying something that's not only more environmentally friendly, but in fact much cheaper. But I can't really blame the Prius drivers because, as we know, trying to be an ethical consumer is very complex, it's very confusing. We're being inundated with a ton of marketing messages. So there's a real marketing strategy behind this, but it's very unclear. We're hearing from different labeling companies, we're hearing from different producers about how to be an ethical consumer. We have to ask questions. Is it best to buy local, to buy organic? Should we support small businesses, or should we support big businesses that are creating jobs? So I want to think about this last point here, and I'm going to do a little bit, I'm going to push the boundaries a little bit. So we sort of vilified Walmart already, as most people, when they talk about ethical consumption, tend to do. But let's think about this last point here. So we're always talking about supporting small businesses. There's this real push to support the little guy down the road, the greengrocer,